hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History by podcast. And today I am joined by David Mirsch and John Winford. And today I'm moderating a debate between the both of them on the subject of, did Jesus survive the crucifixion? David takes the position that Jesus did survive the crucifixion, whereas John takes the position that he did not survive the crucifixion. And with that being said, let me get my timer. There we go. And David, we'll start with you. You have 10 minutes to introduce your argument.
Okay. First of all, hi, John. How you doing?
Good evening. Great. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
You betcha.
My argument is pretty simple. I've written a book called The Open Tomb, Why and How Jesus Faked His Death and Resurrection. And it is about the swoon theory that Jesus actually survived the crucifixion. And it gives a lot of details. It's a fairly lengthy book, but it gives a lot of details from the available evidence of how and why he could have accomplished that, and the difference between just a natural swoon and a conspiracy swoon, where it was planned for him to go through the turmoil and the stress of the crucifixion, and yet still be alive at the end of that. And the book gives the reasons why that was important for him as a leader, to try to inspire the population to join in a revolt against the Roman occupation of Judea and the surrounding areas. Most of what I have come across points to that fact, and the fact that most of what I came across was in the Gospels, was very clearly in the Gospels, and the Gospels make it pretty clear how it was accomplished. Nothing was done that couldn't be done by human beings. It could be done today. It's a bit of magic. It involves a bit of planning, but mostly magic. Some drugs were involved. To me, the idea of some of the things that I came across being accepted by scholarly consensus, when you really look at the consensus and what they believe, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There are arguments, clear arguments against some of those consensus opinions. Some of them are that there's a consensus feeling that Jesus died on the cross. Well, that's a pretty weak argument when you really get into it. Consensus feeling is that the crucifixion must have taken place somewhere around 30 or 33. Again, that is not borne out by other evidence. So that's the consensus really falls apart there. There are some other issues that the consensus believes that really, once you critically analyze the data that's involved in that, they can be blown up pretty easily. And so for me, the important thing is to not be confined by consensus thinking that, hey, it's good to hear those views, but you have to critically analyze them to make sure that what they're saying actually is borne out. And like I said, for me, a lot of it, no, it wasn't borne out. The consensus feeling is a simplified way, I think, for people to jump on board and to go down a certain pathway about Jesus and the crucifixion. And it really just doesn't hold up that well. I will go into detail about how these things actually transpired, why and how Jesus survived, how it was done, why it was important. the fact that he was a military leader. We can get into all of that. Some of the other mistakes that consensus views handle is that he was Galilean or that he was from Nazareth. Again, these are not borne out by the available evidence. So, in the course of this debate with John, hopefully I'll get a chance to go through all that and kind of point out where the mistakes are made and why the reality was vastly different from what consensus thinking is. Short of that, I'll wait until we get in more of the debate to be more specific. I don't want to just rattle on and be, like reading a telephone book. And so I'll turn it over to John. And I'm really interested to hear what John has to say.
So do you rave the rest of your time?
Yes.
Okay. John, your 10 minutes starts now.
I enjoy the fact that he wants to place Jesus as a military leader. And one thing that I think is factual is that Jesus was remembered for 2,000 years because of the human things that he did. He did something so extraordinary that people remembered him. And I do think that he was anti-Roman and anti-Herodian. The Herodians killed his teacher John, and they ended up eventually killing him too. As the Romans and Herodians, they would cut the head off a snake when it comes to anybody who would gather a large crowd. One thing about the Romans, they were masters at killing people. Even the flagellation, often, according to Suetonius and both Josephus, mentioned that the flagellation alone often killed the people before they even got to crucifixion. And then when we talk about nailing his feet and hands to the cross, the Gospels don't mention that in any way. That's actually later put. Now, John does mention that there were wounds, that the wounds are there, but the Synoptics do not. But if you want to, you've got to use the biblical text at some point for evidence. But there is another fact that we have to deal with, and that is that the biblical Jesus is not the historical Jesus. None of the New Testament texts were written by witnesses. Nobody was there. So these aren't eyewitness details that were passed down. And there's a lot of contradictions in the different biblical texts on what exactly transpired and how it transpired. Historically, there was no trial. Historically, the burial, there may not have even been a burial. Some of the best scholars that are out right now think that his body was thrown into an open pit. My own hypothesis is that Golgotha, which is basically hill, or for me, it's pile of bones, was a large pile of bones at the end of where they crucified people. The crucifixion at this temple, you've got to remember, there were 500,000 people almost at every Passover. There were 3 different yearly festivals with roughly 500,000 people at each one. Even if you average it out, you're still getting 1 million people a year that were coming in and out of Israel from the Roman Empire. So when you're talking about crucifixion, there wasn't 1 or 2 or 3 crosses. Romans put the crucifixion crosses at the entryways to the temple or to wherever they crucified people, so as to set an example of what not to do. So the whole idea of this was people entering the temple, they would see the crucified victims on one side or the other, and they were a sign of, don't do this or this is going to be you. So these were masters at killing, and this was a large scale killing. This wasn't a 1 or 2 thing. If you know anything about Passover, this was a festival where sometimes it was the only time a Israelite would eat meat. Wine was required. So basically, this was a big drunken barbecue at God's house. It was basically the party to attend for Roman elite that were interested in the Hellenistic Judaism of the time. So people would travel for months to get here to this big drunken barbecue at God's house. looks like the internet was blinking. Anyway, this wasn't, you would have had a lot of people making mistakes and getting strung up. Even Josephus, when he tells us about the three people that he recognized and wanted, I believe it was Josephus, wanted them taken down off of the cross or off of the poles or however that they were crucified. Two of them did not survive, and only one of them did. So if you look at the biblical description, if they nailed his feet, you're not going to see Jesus walking. Even 40 days later, he wouldn't be out walking around or doing anything like that. So you've got to almost throw the whole biblical theology, which isn't historical. You can't really use it as written. Let's go into what David has to say, and I'll see if there's anything that I can add or detract from it.
All right, so you waited the rest of your time, John?
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to go into the rebuttal rounds. Dave, you're up. You have 5 minutes, starting now.
Okay. Several of the things that John indicated are what I said earlier, consensus thinking. The idea that the Romans were very good at killing people through crucifixion just isn't borne out by reality. In any human endeavor, because humans make mistakes, you have to assign at least, at the bare minimum, a 1% chance that some of these crucifixions are going to be botched. So that's 1 in 100. Now, if you take into account the total number of Roman crucifixions in the thousands, that means hundreds of crucifixions were probably botched. It's not unusual for a basic Roman soldier to make a mistake or misdiagnose death. That happens all the time through history. It happens today. You can read articles about it. Occasionally one will pop up in the news and it'll be somebody was in a hospital, they were pronounced dead, they were put in a hallway on a gurney, and an hour or two later they pop up and they're breathing and they're just fine. The idea that the Romans never made a mistake, then why is the consensus that if they made a mistake, if the Roman soldiers misdiagnosed death, that they would be killed in place of the crucified victim? If it never happened, they wouldn't need that. We, in various times and places in our country, we have had the death penalty for murder, and it hasn't stopped people from killing each other. It's a weak argument that doesn't stand up under scrutiny. The fact that there are gospels written about Jesus indicates that he survived, that he was seen by other people after the crucifixion. If what John is saying, it was true, and he was just another crucified, victim and either thrown into a ditch or a common grave, I find it hard to believe that there would be any gospels written about that situation. People write about things that stand out. And the idea that the gospels don't contain any historical value is kind of silly. You just have to understand what they are. They are political propaganda. They don't have to harmonize. They don't have to tell history, although they do use historical events within them. They are meant to be read and understood to be political propaganda in the effort to create a revolution against the Roman occupiers. Now, there are several things that are said about Jesus that clearly indicate that he's a military leader. And the Dead Sea Scrolls indicate that they were anticipating at least two messiahs, one a religious messiah and the other a military commander like David, King David. Jesus fulfilled the role of being the military person descended from David. I can show you how much time do I have?
1 minute.
Not enough. I'll catch it next time. I can show you how Jesus was more than likely crucified, but I can also tell you that according to Philo, under Tiberius, who didn't really want to have a lot to do with running the empire, he put out a decree that all local customs would be respected. And one of the major ones for Jews was how people were scourged, the 39 lashes that are part of the Torah. That Paul indicates that he survived that on 2 or 3 occasions. And so it's not a Mel Gibson kind of scourging that you're going to see. In Judea, Jesus would have had 39 lashes, and he could have easily survived that. Once I show you how he was actually probably crucified, that'll make a little bit more sense.
Okay, John, your 5 minutes begins now.
Okay. So resurrection, you bring up a good point. The resurrection in academia is not a historical event. And when we look at resurrection, it also wasn't important to every early Christian community. The foundation of the New Testament of the Synoptics is the Markan narrative. The Markan narrative originally almost completely ignores the resurrection because it wasn't the theme to the Markan narrative. The hidden Messiah is what they were selling, and they barely even mention it. There was so little talk of the resurrection in the Markan narrative that the later redactors in the early 2nd century had to add the physical resurrection as the mythology change. And so you're kind of demanding that we all follow a physical resurrection, but when we look at the Pauline, which is our first account of the resurrection in the earliest Christian communities, they're talking about a spiritual resurrection, not a physical resurrection. And then when you get into the Markan narrative, it's not even an important thing. They're not gushing on like, oh my God, this guy freaking survived death, and this is why we got to listen to him. Instead, it's a side note. They barely even discuss it. And it's not until we get to the Lucan and the Matthean narratives that we get into a physical resurrection. So the resurrection theology evolved from spiritual to physical. And you can explain the resurrection as easily as Jesus died on the cross. And the next year at Passover, when people showed up at this big drunken barbecue at God's house, and somebody started repeating the parables that they had learned from Jesus. And oh my God, Jesus lives. Jesus' message lives on. Jesus is alive. It's not hard to see how the resurrection mythology, how Jesus' message lived on, so Jesus lived on. It's pretty simple. And if you remember, it's not really the people that martyred Jesus were not the Aramaic followers of Jesus. We have no writings from them. There was supposed to be the Jerusalem sect, the Aramaic followers in Jerusalem. You had 1 million people coming in and out of Israel for 30 years. That's 30 million people. And not a sentence came from a city with plenty of scribes, and not a sentence came from them that got transferred. I think they say 300,000 Hellenists came from the Roman Empire in and out of Israel at each of these festivals. And again, nothing came from the Aramaic followers. The only people who described Jesus and the only people who martyred him were the Hellenistic proselytes and the Hellenistic Jews that became proto-Christians far from Israel. And there was no one center of origin for Christianity. There were multiple centers, multiple households. And so something that I vehemently would argue against is that the gospel texts were not political propaganda. They were the exact opposite. These were households that were creating a new Son of God, that they were competing against the Roman Emperor, who was the first Son of God. So this was an anti-establishment, anti-political movement in its origin. Did it become political later? Absolutely. Religion's part of society, and the more popular religion gets, the more politicized it gets. So I definitely do not agree with that. But when it comes to resurrection, it's not the foundation of Christianity. And were there some early groups that thought that Jesus had a physical resurrection? I'm sure we had multiple Christologies, many different Christologies, many different explanations as people tried to define what Jesus meant to them. And from the Gnostics, that you had multiple different views on what Jesus was as far as spirit and body. They don't even think he was. They think, some of them think that Jesus' spirit left, that Jesus was born a man, the spirit entered him, and then during the crucifixion, the spirit left, so that because a divine spirit couldn't be tortured and killed. So that's some of the different beliefs that they had.
That's time. So now we're going to move to the second round. 10 minutes for this one. So Dave, your 10 minutes begins now.
Okay. A lot to unpack there. I'm not talking about a resurrection. I'm talking a misdiagnosis of death. That's a different thing. And that it was not accidental. It was planned. And I will tell you this, that all of what you mentioned is agenda-driven years later. Okay. What I'm talking about is more current, and that at least the synoptics were written in the years between 37 and 41. They were written almost concurrently with what was happening. The reason that they weren't particularly focused on Jesus surviving the crucifixion is because he basically failed to get the population motivated. And so it wasn't really important about the resurrection. That, there, like you said, there are a lot of different groups, and some believe that he was resurrected, and some believe that, it was a twin or whatever it was. They had all kinds of different takes on this event because there was an event. He survived the crucifixion. Now, if he only was lashed 39 times, let me show you a couple of things. This is basically a crucifixion nail. And this is very similar to the one that was found in the heel bone of Yehohanan ben Hakal, who was buried in the first century in Jerusalem, who had been crucified. What the Romans pretty quickly realized about crucifixion was that if you nail this through somebody's hand, what you wind up with is the possibility that that person can pull their hand away from it. So what the heel bone that they found had a plaque of olive wood in between the small head of the nail and the actual foot of the crucified person. And what they did was they did this. They put a plaque of wood in between the head of the nail so that the person could not pull their hand through. Okay, they did that on the hands and the feet. Now I've got a model here. Maybe later I'll show it to you how he was actually crucified. But having a nail this small driven through your hands and your ankles, not a problem. Not really a problem. And I'll tell you why. There was a young man named Aaron Ralston some years ago, who went rock climbing in Blue John Canyon in Utah. And he slipped and his arm got pinned by an 800-pound boulder. And after 5 days, when he was out of water and out of food and nobody was coming to help him, he cut off his own arm. And he walked for miles until he found somebody that could help him. Now, you can say it's apples and oranges if you want, but my point is clearly that the human body and the human will to survive can do a lot. And it's like a coyote arm, where a coyote leg caught in a trap, the coyote's going to chew off that leg because they want to survive. And that's the case with Jesus. He had 39 lashes, survivable. He had a small nail driven through his hands and his ankles, survivable. He was drugged to make it appear that he was comatose or dead. This is brought into focus in the Gospels when the bystander rushes up when Jesus calls out, "I thirst," and presents a sponge on a hyssop branch so that Jesus can touch it to his lips. It was transcutaneous drugs in the sponge, and that knocked Jesus out so that he appeared dead. These are not real insurmountable issues. And if you are dissatisfied or up in arms about being occupied by the Romans, and you're a religious fanatic like Jesus was, the idea of trying to go through all this, knowing how, it would be 39 lashes, the small nails, all of that stuff, he was willing to risk all that to appear to have survived a crucifixion. This, he hoped, would elevate him in the eyes of the population and inspire them to revolt against the Romans. Now, some of the other things that you said, it's like, to me, Paul is working off of the Gospels. When he says he has an experience of, hallucination, vision of Jesus, and he also got his information from writings, he's talking about the Gospels. But consensus thinking is always Paul wrote first, therefore whatever he's talking about is not the Gospels. But if I had more time, I would go into why I think and what the evidence shows that the Gospels were written between 37 and 41, the Synoptics anyway. John came along a little bit later. Each of the Gospels, and the correct order is Mark, Luke, Matthew, each one of those corrects something that was wrong in the previous Gospel. And they were written very close together. They weren't written decades later. They weren't written a century later. Again, in a theocracy, theology and political propaganda go hand in hand. So you can't say that, these were written as theological tracts. No, they're written as political propaganda. And writing them between 37 and 41 brings into account Gaius Caligula's threat to build a statue of himself just outside of the temple. That's what triggers the writing of the Gospels. When Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple, and he's already been accused by people that were in the court, that he said that he could take down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. He's talking about the temple being so ruined by this statue of Caligula that, never mind the Romans knocking it down, the Jews, the faithful Jews, were going to knock it down because it was no longer pure. Now, the other reason that I think he survived is that the Gospels talk about him being buried in a brand new tomb. Okay, this is part of the plan. He can't be buried in just any old tomb, because if he's alive and he's walking around, if he was buried in any used tomb, he would be ritually impure. And it would take at least a week of purification rituals so that he could be in the public eye. So the Gospels make a point of saying that he was buried in a new tomb where nobody had been laid before. All of these things that are actually in the Gospels point to how it was done, why it was done. and it really shows up the fact that scholarly consensus in general is pretty weak. I don't think the people that are in the consensus that go along with that consensus view have ever really taken the time to step back and look at it and go, can this be true? How am I doing for time, Jacob?
You have 1 minute and 18 seconds.
Okay. There's other things that we could go into about, how and why the Gospels are represented this way. But the main thing is that, and scholars will, I think, agree with this, Mark is especially written as something immediate, that there's an immediate tone to the things that are written in there. That's because they were written with the threat of the statue being put in front of the temple and desecrating the temple so it could no longer be used. And if you read Philo, you'll understand that there was a Roman legion that was coming to enforce this. That's what Jesus was talking about when he said, if this happens, you need to be running to the hills because we're going to be surrounded by armies and we're going to have problems. As it turned out, Caligula died before that statue could be built and placed in front of the temple. But the Gospels, especially Mark, were written at the time that was a real threat. Anyway, I must be close.
That's about time. Now it is. Okay, John, 10 minutes.
Okay, the early dating of the Gospels will never fly. It's great that you have that opinion, but there's too much evidence. The three Gospels are pretty adamant about the temple's destruction, and they allude to it. You don't have to like it, you don't have to accept it, but they do, and that's why the consensus actually has the dating. When you look at how early Christians met and gathered, so they would meet at an event like Passover, and you'd get like-minded theology. There was no orthodox in Judaism. There were multiple different views, but you would get people that would hang out in their own specific little groups and talk and discuss. So early proto-Christians that still considered themselves Hellenistic Jews would gather with other Hellenistic Jews and proselytes and Gentiles, and they would discuss what Jesus had meant to them. But with that being said, I just don't think that the evidence is there for any sort of claim. When you claim that that you've got is there a specific verse that you're using to call these political text? Because we don't see it. What's the motive of the author is what you want to get at. And when you look at the prose that they wrote in, these are sales pieces, but they're not selling politically motivated tradition. They're selling theology, and they're selling a divorce of the Israelites' Judaism as they started to create their own Hellenistic Judaism, which evolved into Christianity. I think when you have a fringe theory, you need to have some extraordinary evidence if you want to overturn the consensus. And I don't think that you've met that mark. The evidence is basically your personal opinion versus the personal opinion of other people. I think it's fine and dandy to go down these rabbit holes and to look and to see and play them out to see what sticks against the wall. But I don't think that you've provided us with enough evidence to overturn the current consensus, in my opinion. And I could be wrong. I'm not trying to hammer you. It's just you haven't told me anything other than you disagree, and that it was a conspiracy. And how, if you look at what Aramaic Galilean peasants were, I don't think they would have the means to pull this off. And to have somebody survive the Roman flagellation and crucifixion, I don't think you can even pull that 1% that you were talking about. I think that's just something you made up. It's not based on any evidence as far as 1%. It's just something that you'd like it to be true. And I don't think that you really didn't substantiate 1% in any way. Is it possible that somebody survived? Yes. Josephus tells us that 1 out of 3 survived when the highest ranking official in the Roman army had them taken down. But for a conspiracy, I mean, you're starting to sound a little tinfoil hatty when you say conspiracy. Is it possible that they put poison in? Yes, but so you're using a lot of the gospel text. The gospels say that Jesus was run through with a spear, basically, and the water poured out. So
it doesn't say that.
You didn't say that. The gospel texts say that, though.
No, it doesn't.
And so you're using the gospel text and you're cherry picking what you want out of them to get the story that you want. But if we look at some of these texts, he didn't survive it. He resurrected because he actually died, if you want to use the texts themselves as an example. But I don't think you can overcome the early dating. There's a few people that usually apologists, well, and I'm not calling you an apologist, but usually apologists are the ones that go with the early dating camp as opposed to the academic consensus. And then you've got people that are late daters. But anyway, I don't think you don't have enough evidence to overturn the dating of Mark at 70. But anyway, what I forgot while I was talking was that the early Christians met and gathered. And when the temple fell, it changed the way that all early Christians met. And so when the temple fell, there was an instant need to preserve the traditions that they had shared for 30 years. And that's where we get our first gospel, Mark. And then from there it evolves and the theology evolved and we get the different texts following. But that's how I see it. And, I wish you luck on trying it, but I'd like to see you be able to substantiate your claims a little better.
Be happy to.
Fair enough. I'm done.
Be happy to.
Do you wait the rest of your time, John?
Yeah, I've said enough.
All right, 10 minutes, Dave.
Okay. Basically, again, you're following consensus views, which are incorrect. The very first thing you do when you're going to analyze the Gospels is figure out what they are. Now, I say they're political propaganda. How do I back that up? Well, because if you're a rebel leader, you're not going to write things to be taken at face value. You're going to use allegory, metaphor, symbolism to get your point across without having the Romans come down on you and scoop you up and kill you because you're seditious. So when I look at that, and when I look at the Gadarene demoniac story, I see it as a story about Antipas forcefully populating his new city of Tiberias. Tiberias that he built was built on an ancient cemetery, an ancient Jewish cemetery, which meant no Jew wanted to live there. And so he had to force people, he had to use the Roman legion, the 10th Fretensis, to keep people, Jewish people, in that city. That's what the Gadarene demoniac is all about. It is about a man who is chained in a cemetery and who is taken over by demons. And Jesus comes along and says, get ye gone, demons. And what does Jesus say? What are you called? And the demons go, we are legion. And they turn into a group of swine that run down a hill and drown themselves. Now, the battle flag of the 10th Fretensis Legion is a wild boar, a pig. So what Jesus has done is he has taken that situation, political situation, where people are being forced to be ritually unclean and live in this city that's on an ancient cemetery. And he has turned it into a story that the people that he spoke to or wrote about would understand what he was saying. Okay. Number 2, the Samaritan woman at the well. She's got 5 husbands, the last of which she's not even married to. How does Jesus know this? First of all, there is no way that a man, Jesus, is going to be talking to a woman, a Samaritan woman. Not going to happen. So right away, you know, this is an allegorical tale. And the 4 previous husbands were 4 previous rulers of Samaria. That's what he's talking about when he says that. The last one, who she's not even married to, is Rome, is the Roman army, the Roman occupiers. That's why she's not married to it. Throughout the Gospels, certain things represent real situations. And if you don't understand that when you're looking at the Gospels, you have no way of understanding what is going on. But again, the Samaritan woman is a political statement. It's not theological. He's talking to the Samaritan population, represented by the woman by the well. And he is saying to them, basically, your last husband, supposedly, you know, you're not married to him, so that's a sin right there. And if you want to be free of that, if you want to feel and understand the living water that I preach, you know, you need to move away from that. You need to change your point of view. He's basically recruiting the Samaritan population to revolt. Now, interestingly, the well that this Samaritan woman is at in this story is more than likely Jacob's well, which is at the foot of Mount Gerizim, which is where in late in 36, the Samaritan uprising took place. So the connection between this story and the Samaritan uprising at the foot of Mount Gerizim, pretty serious, pretty clear cut to me. If you want to think that, you know, your consensus view is that these are theological and these are just stories, I'll tell you another one. When Jesus saves the child of Yairus, and he says to Yairus, no, he says to the 12-year-old girl, he says to her in Aramaic, Talitha Kumai, which is a little bit awkward, but it means, little girl, I say to you, rise up. That is a call to the people in Antipas's area east of the Jordan for the younger population to rise up against the Romans. Now, no, I don't hear any other scholars pointing to what they think the Gospels represent. What I hear is they're not histories, they're not biographies, you know, they could be fiction, they could be this, they could be that. No, I honestly, I don't need a tinfoil hat, thank you very much, to look at these things and go, you know, these are political propaganda. And one other thing, when the Jews confront Jesus about who he hangs out with, he says, they say to him, why do you hang out with prostitutes and tax collectors? As a military leader, those are two groups of people that you want to hang out with. Prostitutes can tell you, you know, military disbursement, where the army is, where the soldiers are, you know, lining up. You hang out with tax collectors, and you can interfere with the flow of money to the Roman army. There were plenty of other sinners that they could have brought up. And there are plenty of other sinners that Jesus might have hung out with. But he's hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors for a reason, because militarily, those are smart, you know, ways to gain information. You know, I mean, it could go on and on. Of his 12 disciples, you know, at least 7 of them have violent names or nicknames. Judas Iscariot, you know, from the Sicarii knife, you know, a couple others that are in there that when they come to a village with Jesus, the apostles say, they've kind of shunned us. Should we burn it down? Should we burn the village down? Because they don't, they're not paying attention to us. And Jesus says, no, just knock the dust off your shoes and let's just walk away. The fact that they would even think about burning down a village indicates that the people following him were military people or people that were prepared to revolt. These aren't peaceful, hey, love your brother type of people. Jesus says, sell your cloak, buy a sword. These are odd things for somebody who's, preaching love and trust and love your neighbor to be saying and to be doing. So yeah, there is a lot of evidence within the Gospels that confirm what I'm saying. All you have to do is know, that they're not written to be taken at face value. They're written allegorically. And the other thing I would mention is that the desolation of abomination, the abomination that is in the word abomination that's translated from the Greek word in the New Testament is a singular neuter. In other words, a single thing that is neither male or female. It's a statue. So you can say what you want about, consensus, saying that they were written after the destruction and then placed back into the Gospels to show that Jesus could predict the future. That's really kind of convoluted thinking. It's much easier to say, which we know from Philo, Caligula was going to, burn down a lot of the Jewish places. He was going to have this giant statue of himself placed in front of the temple. And Jesus was saying, this is an abomination. We can't have that.
You have 21 seconds left. You want to waive that?
Yeah, go ahead and waive it.
Okay, John, 10 minutes.
Okay. So it seems to me you're alluding that Jesus had some kind of that he's directing the New Testament text, and or his followers are projecting their ideals are found in the New Testament. And I've got to say we don't see any of that. What these texts represent are what the Hellenistic Roman citizens far from Israel thought about Jesus. So it's none of these texts came from Israel. All of the texts are compilations. So it's not something that one person sat down and wrote or a group of Jesus' followers wrote. There's no eyewitness testimony to Jesus or Jesus' ministry in the whole New Testament. So the idea that Jesus is projecting something of his, I actually agree with you about his rebelliousness. I think that if you want to call him a little bit of a zealot, that's fine, but you've got to understand that the word zealot doesn't necessarily mean a singular sect. It was a slur, a Hellenistic slur aimed at Galileans who were all viewed as troublemakers. So in that aspect, Jesus was a zealot because of his Galilean heritage. So when they call them zealots, it's not just a sect like Josephus, like all the other sects. It's basically a negative term used at Galileans because they weren't under the Roman military thumb and they were rebellious. So in a way, I do agree that, and I do think that the fact that Jesus was crucified at Passover, he was crucified for causing some kind of unknown trouble in the temple. And that alone tells you that he was rebellious to some extent. I don't think that we can say what kind of rebel he was, but I'm going to agree with you that, yeah, Jesus was a rebel. He was anti-Herodian and anti-Roman, since those were the two institutions, as Herodian as a client king, that were his direct oppressors in Galilee. And in Israel, you had the Herodians and the Roman military that helped police the events that helped direct the oppression to the peasant population. But there's very little of Jesus exists in the New Testament. When we look at the parables in the New Testament, according to the Jesus Seminar, about 30% of those parables can be tied to Jesus. But when I say tied to Jesus, I had this question with the seminar myself. They were in my city one year, and I questioned them, and could have those parables that are attributed to Jesus, could have those been John's parables that Jesus learned from John? And they said, absolutely, we can't say it's one or the other. So those are basically the 30% very well could be John's parables that were repeated, but they could also be just Galilean peasant parables that were common. So that 30% isn't 30%, 100%, or 100%, that 30% of the parables are directly tied to Jesus. They're not. We want them to be, and we'd love them to be, so that we can actually pin down more of what Jesus was. But the 30% of the parables have no of that we do attribute to Jesus have no political aspirations. And when you try to say they're political, the first and earliest Christians were viewed as atheists because they wouldn't worship the Roman emperor as son of God, because they already worshiped Jesus as son of God. So these were viewed as baby killers and drinking the blood of babies from the Eucharist tradition. There were all kinds of nasty little Roman polemic going around, and Jewish polemic against them, just for who they were. So these were anti-establishment, anti-political. And early Christianity was born out of Roman households with the main context of what Jesus actually meant to them. And these are the ones who introduced the peaceful Jesus, which I think you agree that wasn't what Jesus was preaching. And I don't think that Jesus was preaching peaceful either. These Roman citizens didn't want to be chastised by the Romans, so they added the peaceful elements. So I think you'd have to get more specific besides just describing a few parables of what may be, which can be translated and taken into different contexts in multiple ways instead of just the one way that you're stating. And at least you tried, and you gave a good example of what you feel took place. Good enough for me, Jacob.
All right, so you waive the rest of your time?
Sure.
All right, final round. Dave, 10 minutes.
Oh, God, where to start? First of all, you base a lot of your argument on things that transpired later. If Jesus survived the crucifixion, which I claim, then yes, he was available to fill in some of the written Gospels. He would have been available. And I'm fairly convinced that Philo is the one who wrote at least Mark and Luke, probably Matthew, for various reasons. And there's a fairly long list. Philo was a contemporary of Jesus. He was also a temple priest. So he would have been involved. And you have to remember that Philo was heavily rejected by Caligula when the embassy to Gaius took place. Caligula wouldn't even listen to him. And so Philo had a real reason to want to stop what was going to happen with the statue. And I would really recommend, maybe you have already, I don't know, but I would really recommend reading Philo either in the embassy or Flaccus, where he goes into what the Romans were threatening to do. This isn't something that, is written after the destruction of the temple. This is something that is written concurrent with the threat of what was going to happen to the Jewish culture. Okay, that's really important because you have to have a strong motive for why they were written. Writing them after the destruction of the temple takes away any strong motive. And I'm not really interested in what early Christians came up with because they were agenda driven. Okay, they wanted to create a certain Christ. And like you said, there's various groups that were interested in that, and they could gain power and control by starting these different sects. So I'm not interested in looking at all that stuff. I'm not interested in anything that was written post 70, really. As far as Philo is concerned, as the writer, one of the main things that came out of a study from Stanford School of Philosophy is that unique amongst all ancient writers, Philo wrote Hebrew works in Greek with Latin titles. Okay, he was unique in that. That's like a fingerprint. And that's exactly what the Gospels are. They're Jewish writings written in Greek with Latin titles. Mark is a Latin title. Luke is a Latin title. You could stretch it a little bit and say Matthew, yeah, you know, that could be Greek, that could be Latin. Mark is based on the Latin Marcus for Mars, the god of war. Luke is based on Lucifer, the bringer of light, which was referred, you know, Jesus was referred to. All of these things stack up pretty neatly, I think. Philo wrote in a chiastic structure. The Gospels are written in a chiastic structure. Philo wrote in different not languages, but his type of writing or his sense of writing could change depending on who he was writing to. That's why you don't see a consistent, between Mark and Luke and Matthew, that they seem to be written by different people. No, it's Philo writing, you know, those, but to different audiences and with a different tone. To ignore those things that I'm talking about indicates to me that, you know, the argument that you're presenting doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You don't know the writers. You don't have a motive for why they're written. You're placing a lot of strength on consensus views about them being written after the destruction of the temple. There's no motive for that. There's nothing stated for that. That is a consensus view that he somehow, you know, was, you know, written in later to present him as being able to predict the future. He didn't have to predict the future. I'm not a big believer that he predicted anything. When he was going to be crucified, he supposedly predicted to his apostles that, yes, I'm going to suffer. Yes, I'm going to be killed. Yeah, he said that because he knew what was going to happen. He didn't predict the future. He planned the future. He knew what he was going to go through. That's how he could say those things to the people following him. The other thing about him being involved as a military leader is that he preached to the poor. He preached to the poor in that situation because anybody with money is beholding to the Romans to have wealth. And he didn't want anybody involved with Rome to be part of his revolution. So that meant that he had to preach poverty, preach to the poor, because they were the one. Their tax system, some of those people were taxed 40%.
More.
Or more.
Yeah.
Yeah. By the time you got done paying for Rome and the local ruler and whoever else, you know, had their hand, the temple, you know, those three things right there took most of the wages away from these poor people. They were probably pretty tired of it. So they were, you know, the people that you want to go to and say, hey, this needs to stop and we need to revolt to stop it. The other thing that I think you get wrong that is consensus is that he was Galilean. But in the Samaritan woman, she calls him a Judean. She sees him walk up and says, why would you, a Jew, talk to me? She recognizes that he's Judean. And back then, because of the provincial attitude of things, there were at least 6 or 7 different ethnic groups. They had different accents. They wore different clothes. They identified with their province. That's how she could recognize him as he walked up, that he's a Jew. He's a Judean. He's not Galilean. So that consensus view really doesn't hold up either. We could, if we had more time, I'd go into his actual parentage and the fact that he wasn't a poor carpenter, that he was a priest that worked on the temple with his father. They were known as tectones. That is in Josephus, that some of the priests were trained to be tectones to work on the temple so that the temple wouldn't be desecrated by non-Jewish people working on it. We can go into that maybe some other time. We don't have time for it right now. But he wasn't poor, and he was well known. And he came from an upper strata of society. That's how he got his education. It wasn't miraculous. It wasn't, something that he just had. He learned all these things because he had an education available to him that he wouldn't have had growing up as the son of a poor carpenter. Again, consensus view, they don't seem to really analyze things. They just jump on a bandwagon and say, yeah, it was probably written after the 70s. Yeah, he was a poor carpenter, an itinerant preacher. He was this, he was that. No, sorry. I'll waive the rest of my time. I mean, I could go into a lot more, but, I want to give John a chance to rebut.
Okay, John, 10 minutes.
There's so much to talk about. Tecton, according to Jonathan Reed, the head archaeologist of Sepphoris, who spent the most time and most recent time working there, is also worked with John Crossan on this. And a tecton is actually, in context, a negative slur. And we see in the text in the first use of tecton, and then in the later versions, they try to minimize Jesus' actual role as being part of a tecton because of the negative slur. And what it actually means is displaced peasant who lost their leased land and now had to do menial labor if they could find a job day by day, basically working with their hands. And Ken Dark recently found some quarried areas of Nazareth where stonework was done in the early first century, as opposed to all the evidence in Nazareth used to be a couple of shards found in the bottom of a hole that dated close to the time of the war, but not before. So there is a good possibility that Joseph and Jesus were tectons of stone instead of tectons of wood. He was never a carpenter per se, and a little hovel like Nazareth didn't really have any meaningful employment. There wouldn't have been any work for a tecton there, provided Jesus did live there, as you're trying to unsubstantiate, I guess you can say. So with that being said, that a tecton doesn't necessarily mean carpenter or skilled craftsman in any way, as used in the New Testament. And when we get to the New Testament, we know exactly what they're saying. There's nothing hidden. The prose that the New Testament text was written in is called Aristotelian rhetorical prose. So the scribes are actually going out of their way to sell you their theology. And that's what they're selling. They're not selling anything else. Their theology of Jesus. These are religious texts, and they're selling religion. And they're selling their version of religion that was competing against other versions of Jesus. You got to remember, there were multiple Christologies. So if Jesus died on the cross, what would you expect people would write? They would write 15 different versions of what that crucifixion meant to them. What do we have for evidence? We've got 15 different versions of what Jesus meant to them. If Jesus was alive after crucifixion and Jesus was responsible, we would have one coherent story that centered out of Israel and then spread from Israel out into everywhere else, and it would be a more coherent single story instead of multiple versions that were compiled together, which is what we see right now. We see multiple different versions. The idea that one author penned the four different gospels to me is ludicrous, but I'm going to try to be nice. I like Dave. He's a gentleman and a scholar. But at the same time, it's just completely unsubstantiated. I would try to keep in the future. I'd try to keep that away from your hypothesis, because it really detracts from it so much. And again, if you're going to take a fringe theory, then you need some really strong evidence to fight to come over. And it's not just the consensus; it's what the evidence shows when you're looking at the different the context that they wrote these texts in are pretty dang obvious. They didn't go out of the way. They're selling you something that you can see right then and there. They're selling you that Jesus is the way to the future, and the way that poor people can avoid the political government, and that they can worship God through Jesus. And for the poor people, not the rich people, you don't have to go to the Jewish temple and pay money for doves, pay money for meat, pay money for wine, the road tax, the bridge tax, the income tax, getting there. You got to remember, the temple was the most successful business in its time, and one of the most opulent, epic places to go to around during this period. This was the party to be. And again, Roman citizens they flocked by the hundreds of thousands to each of these 3 yearly festivals that this story is placed in. I think I'm going to close up just with saying that according to the majority, and I'm going to use the consensus of the scholars, is that the crucifixion is a certainty. And I mean, even you agree with me that the crucifixion is a certainty. And their history is not something that you would ever claim something is certain. But if there's a certainty in history, crucifixion is one of the most historical things about Jesus that we have, other than being baptized by John. Those are the two strongest things that hold historicity about Jesus. And them Romans, they didn't mess around. They were pretty sharp. Did he survive it? I don't think so. And I'd like to see you provide more evidence than the possible conspiracy based on them than a New Testament story that isn't historical to begin with, about the foam to the lips and that. Is it possible? Nothing's impossible, but I don't think you bared the preponderance of evidence to substantiate your claims. But I enjoyed the discussion with you, and I wish I could remember things a little better.
So now we're going to enter you say you wait the rest of your time, John?
Sure.
So now we're going to enter the discussion and Q&A phase. So perhaps both of you can get more into the evidence further now. Awesome.
Yeah, because there's a lot of things he said that I forget by the time we get around to my turn, and likewise, I'm sure for him too. So,
So I'm gonna start the timer, 30 minutes for the discussion phase, and we'll take the questions, super chat questions, after the 30 minutes are up. All right, go ahead.
Well, can I start off with one little thing? Because I forget. It's the socioeconomic status of Israelites during Jesus' lifetime. You had the Aramaic peasants.
Yep. John, you froze up.
There we go. I'm back, hopefully. All right. The Israelite peasants who were heavily oppressed, which David touched on. And when he talks about Tiberias and Sepphoris were both Hellenistic cities of the elite who did the majority of the oppressing in the Galilean areas. And with that being said, the socioeconomic status was you had 90% of the rich people that were dealing with 10% of the poor. They made life so miserable. The Hellenists made life so miserable for the Israelite nationalist. People don't realize how bad this was. And you had pro-Hellenism and you had pro-nationalism. And when we get into that, if you look at Hillel was pro-Hellenism. Shammai was pro-nationalism. And so the Pharisees were actually a heavily divided group in the temple. They were not a coherent unit. They were actually divided between nationalism and a zealot-like philosophy. So you had the rebel narrative with Jesus mixed in with all this. It's all, but the socioeconomic, there was no middle class. You either had the poor and destitute who were on the brink of starvation. For Jesus, it was a matter, he might as well die at the Passover, trying to rally the crowd against and overthrow the corrupt Herodian temple cult and these other Hellenistic Jews that were perverting his Judaism, than actually trying to earn out a meager living doing whatever he did. It was a terrible time to be alive, I'll tell you that much.
If you didn't have money.
Right.
First things first, the 1% that I brought up has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, other than it's a statistical baseline. In other words, any human endeavor, because humans are imperfect, will have faults and errors. And to represent that fact, 1% is the lowest that you can go. In other words, 1% of anything that's done by humans is more than likely to have mistakes or failures or whatever. Okay. So that's just a statistical reality. So, like I said, that's 1 in 100. If you take the number of crucifixions that the Romans performed, there were plenty of mistakes judging whether a crucified victim was dead or not. There would have had to be statistically. Okay. The fact that nobody wrote about it, don't know what to tell you. Tectones. If Josephus is talking about priests learning to be tectones to work in the temple, what a good scholar does, because Jesus and his father were called tectones, is they backtrack and they look at the Gospels again and they say, is it possible that Jesus and his father were priests? And of course, when you start looking at things, you go, yeah, they could be. The birth of Jesus, who's there? You've got the flocks and you have the, who takes care of a flock?
The shepherd.
The shepherds, thank you. Throughout the New Testament, the term shepherd is roughly used 20 times to indicate somebody in a leadership position, either in the church or elsewhere. There's only one time that it's claimed that that is not the case, and that is at the birth of Jesus. So statistically, I would look at that again as doing critical analysis and say, well, if they're talking about shepherds and flocks at his birth, they are talking about civic leaders and they are talking about population. So would a poor guy from, and we'll get into Nazareth in a minute here, would a poor guy have all that? Would he be given all these wealthy things? Would he be given gold, frankincense, and myrrh at his birth? No, he wouldn't. Because, and here's the interesting part, real shepherds in that society were considered only slightly better than thieves, because they would let their flocks graze on land without compensating the owners of that land. So if you think that, Jesus at his birth is getting all this wealth in front of a bunch of shepherds that are more than likely to, kill them on their way home and take all the goods, I got news for you. That wasn't the case. The idea of Nazareth, if Philo, as I claim, wrote the Synoptics, what?
Hold on, we lost John.
Huh? Oh, we lost John.
Give me a second. Okay, he's back in. There we go. Continue, Dave.
Sorry, my connection dropped. I just switched to
That's okay.
a better connection.
Philo was only familiar with the Septuagint. If Jesus was a Nazarite, if he had made a Nazarite vow, Philo would have had a hard time translating that into Greek because there was no term in Greek to basically say the same thing. So what Philo had to do was he had to come up with a word that approximated Nazarite. And Nazarenos was the word that he chose. That later got changed to Nazareth. There was no Nazareth. Jesus was born in Bethlehem because he and his father were priests. They would have stayed either in a locale where his father had a flock that he had to take care of, but he would have grown up more than likely in Jerusalem or in Judea. So the idea that, the consensus view is that he's Galilean doesn't hold up under closer scrutiny. It just doesn't. If the Samaritan woman saw him as a Judean, and if Philo had only the Greek Septuagint to figure out, and write who he was, and he had taken a Nazarite vow, which Philo could not translate into Greek, you got to get rid of Nazareth. You just have to. It didn't exist. Here's the other thing too. Even if they lived in Nazareth and they were builders, it's 2 miles, at least 2 miles between Nazareth and Sepphoris, which would be,
It's a 4 mile walk.
Yeah, 4 miles.
Yeah.
So one way, right? That's one way.
One way. Correct.
Okay. So you're walking at 2 miles an hour, carrying heavy tools, and you're going to be walking, 8 miles a day, and they don't have any land. Why the hell would they do that? Why not just move to Sepphoris, take your tools there and work there and do what needs to be done? It doesn't make sense. Okay. So the idea, and Nazareth doesn't match some of the gospel stories of the actual topography that is in the gospels. Like when he is taken up to a cliff and threatened to be thrown off. There's no such cliff like that in the actual Nazareth location. It's all hills. Now, if you can kill somebody by throwing them down a hill, okay, maybe that was true. I don't buy it. There's no Nazareth.
Let me start answering just a few things before I get lost here, because you bring up so much, and I love the discussion. But as far as a shepherd goes, it's not likely. I mean, that's not a historical thing. You seem to be placing a lot of literal interpretation of the Gospels. You're using as being historical, and they're simply not. But the shepherd business.
Wait! Before we go off the rails here, how do you prove that they're not historical?
Because there's different stories that contradict each other.
In political propaganda, that doesn't matter. The main message is
political propaganda. Wouldn't it be fiction?
Yeah, and there's certainly later redactions that are changed and put in there. Sure, absolutely.
With that being said, a shepherd is not a historical description of Jesus. No scholar claims that he was ever a shepherd. With that being said, the lamb business and sheep business was run by the temple priests, by the temple elite that were basically, they were running the business of Israel, and they were the main oppressors of the peasant class that Jesus was fighting. So unless he's turning on his employer,
Yeah.
But again, I don't think that. These are stories in the New Testament. They're not history, and so you've got to. There's so much you have to prove to go through your story, and I can't. Just because it says it there doesn't mean
there's no rebuttal. There's no rebuttal. I'm telling you the stories.
Well, no, you're taking a literal reading of the text.
No, I'm not. I'm taking an allegorical reading of the text, and I'm reading Josephus. Now, if tectone was a derogatory term, I don't think that he would have used that to describe the priests that were trained to build the temple.
Well, how Josephus was using it was not how the gospel authors used it. Completely different context. It meant different things the way that each of them had used it. And because that was just a Greek word for craftsman. But if you look at the Greek language, how they set it up and how we see later authors, the later Gospels, talking about it, they're trying to minimize Jesus' relationship against a tecton. And there's arguments for and against, but that's just how most see it. And again, it's not just a majority view, but the work of Jonathan Reed and John Crossan pretty much are spot on. Again, there was no middle class. There was either the low of the low or there were the Hellenists. So if you claim that Jesus had wealth, then you're claiming he was part of the elite, that he wasn't an Aramaic peasant. You're claiming that he was a Hellenistic Jew.
No, he was part of the priestly class. You left them out. There's the poor. There's the Hellenists.
Most of the priestly class in the temple were Hellenists.
Yeah, okay, but we don't have any proof of that. Okay, we don't have a breakdown statistically of how many of the priests were Hellenists, how many were, just temple priests for the people. We just don't have that information. So that's kind of throwing something out there that doesn't have any backing.
We have plenty of backing. All of the Herodian temple cult were Hellenists. The people who ran the temple was the Herodian cult. It wasn't the Israelite nationalists. And we have Hillel, we have Shammai, we had the conflict between nationalists, the division of the Pharisees. You had the Sadducees who ran the sheep business, and they were also all Hellenists. And those were the temple priests and everybody else. You basically had oppressors and oppressed. And that was your socioeconomic class. And if Jesus is a rebel, he's not part of the rich. Rich don't have anything to complain about. He's part of the dirt poor who would rather die than live. I can
give you a very current, fairly current parallel to that, and that is Osama bin Laden. He was from one of the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia, and he chose to go live in caves. Okay, he gave up, all the trappings of his family's wealth because he was a religious fanatic. And I see Jesus as a religious fanatic trying to get rid of the Roman occupiers. That's current. You can see it. It happens. It happens in life. People that are wealthy or children that grow up in a wealthy environment can often go in a different direction than their parents.
Let's say I agree with you on that. How do you explain the anti-temple textual traditions in the New Testament? There's a ton of anti-Herodian temple, the evil Pharisees, the woes of the Pharisees, et cetera, et cetera. The New Testament are full of anti-temple text. Why? Why is there so much polemic against that? Not only that, if Jesus was part of that, why is the New Testament full of polemic against the 12 followers? Is there introduced in the New Testament?
To you. He was part of it. He didn't agree with it. He was accused of claiming to tear down the temple, even though he disagreed with it because they taxed the poor to almost poverty levels. That's not surprising.
Below poverty. I mean, it was terrible.
Below poverty, yeah.
Right. Romans were masters of exploiting a country's resources and squeezing the local population to the point of just above the point of survival.
Exactly. Do I think that there could have been people in the priesthood that disagreed with all that? Yep, sure could have. That's not anything. And so the polemic against the temple priests or the temple itself is not surprising.
But why the polemic against the 12 Aramaic followers?
That may have been a later redaction. I mean, some of this stuff you have to look at and you go, is that current? Would that have been current at the time that he was teaching? Or is that a later, redaction that some Christian entered into it?
Why would a later Christian say that Jesus calls Peter the devil? The way that the 12 are introduced is almost negative in Mark when they're first explaining the whole story to you.
That's
they're
easy to
showing
explain.
a negative light.
That's easy to explain because they're not getting the message. Jesus is spelling it out to them, and they're not getting it. This is in the Gospels. He said, some of you are going to get this, some of you are not. He's speaking in allegory.
He says that all the 12 are misunderstood, and the Gospels paint Judas as a traitor who directly betrayed him. They paint Peter as denying him multiple times. Thomas doubted him. They're all played in a negative light, and that has to be explained.
Peter bailed out on him, didn't have faith in the movement. Judas was part of the movement and had to turn Jesus in for him to be crucified. He had to go to the authorities and say, I know where this rabble-rouser is. I'll take the money. I'll show you where he is. That's just part of the game plan.
What if you had the Aramaic group saying one thing about Jesus, and the Hellenistic people who were martyring Jesus were saying another, and so they had to fight the negative polemic the Aramaic people were producing, and they fought it with the textual traditions, in part with the textual traditions. So in the text, we see polemic against the 12 while still holding them at a high standard as pillars. That's how I see it, but it just behooves me sometimes.
Well, to me, it's like that's just a case of characterizing people that weren't understanding the message and claiming they're, following Satan rather than listening to Jesus because they're being weak. Because they're being. Let me
bring up an important point really quick, and I'm sorry I didn't mean to interrupt, but it's important. I will forget because you bring up so much good stuff. But the text, the New Testament text, says that Jesus' own family called him crazy. I don't think that's something that is true in any sense of the word. I don't think
that's the example.
The people who understood Jesus the best were the people who grew up with him, which would have been all his fisherman buddies and people that suffered with him on a daily basis, and that learned under John with him when he was studying under John, and John baptized him. These were all people that believed and were on the same page. So I don't buy that there was negative polemic between Jesus and his followers. There was polemic between the Hellenists who are perverting Judaism and the real Jews who are standing up for what Jesus taught. But you see it another way, that's okay.
Yeah, the point about the family proves my point. If he came from a wealthy family and he's talking about rebelling against the Romans, his family is going to be hurt financially. So they're going to call him crazy at first to even think about disrupting their lifestyle. Okay? That makes perfect, normal sense for a family that is watching one of their own go out in the world and preach against what is keeping them in money. They're not going to be happy
with that. Why do you know why the New Testament would portray Jesus as poor if he was rich? Because they're claiming he was from Nazareth, which was the poor.
He's preaching to the poor. He's preaching to the poor. Are the poor going to listen to a rich guy talking about a rebellion? No, because they're going to do the same thing the family did. Why are you talking about a rebellion? You're wealthy. The Romans are keeping you in money. Why are you preaching this? He wouldn't have gotten very far. The point is, he went to the poor because they were the most likely to rebel. Rich people were not interested in rebelling because they were wealthy. That's why when that wealthy young man comes up to him and says, "Can I join your group?" and Jesus says, "You got to get rid of everything you own." And the guy turns around and leaves because he doesn't want to do that. He's not going to give up his wealth to join a rebellious group. He's just not. And that's normal human nature. Same with the family. They're going to look at this son, this brother, this whatever in the family and go, "You're crazy. You're crazy to be doing this because we have a good life."
Let me ask you a question while I got you here. What do you think Jesus did in the temple to get crucified?
Well, Crucifixion is the only form of capital punishment that is survivable. Okay. John got his head cut off. You can't survive that. Other Jewish means of capital punishment were stoning and drowning. You can't survive either one of those. Do I think that his father, who was a priest as well, pushed for a crucifixion because he was part of the plan and he knew that he could survive that? Yeah. So to me, it's like that again justifies what I'm saying.
All right, but you're talking about the punishment. I'm talking about the crime. What crime did he commit to get crucified is what I'm trying to get out of you. He planned or not. He had to commit a crime.
I think the Romans saw him as seditious, which would have led to capital punishment. How
would they see him as seditious? He had to have done something. There was 500,000 people there. It's not like he was obvious one person out of hundreds of thousands of people. He had to have actually done something to warrant crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just trying to figure out what you think that he did, because you'd have to get noticed to get crucified. What did he do to deserve that punishment?
Well, I'm pretty and there's two reasons here. I'll try to get to them both really quick. I'm a believer that the Samaritan uprising was led in part by Jesus and John. And when John was beheaded because he could gather a crowd of people, which is what Josephus claims, it's because of that uprising. I think Josephus probably knew who Jesus was, but did not name him. If you look at the Testimonium Flavianum, it comes at a point right before the chapter that has the Samaritan uprising. Some Christian came along and plugged that in to distract you from the idea that maybe Jesus was responsible for the Samaritan uprising. The other thing is that the Barabbas episode, if you look at it, Barabbas' first name was Jesus. So you have Jesus, son of the Father, or you have Jesus, King of the Jews. Okay? There's no second person there. It's one person, and Pilate is being Pilate. He's taunting the crowd. Who do you want me to save? Jesus, the King of the Jews, or Jesus, son of the Father? It's a no-win situation for the crowd. So they pick Jesus, King of the Jews. They can't go against God. They're not going to pick somebody that is the son of the Father, which represents God. They're going to pick the other one. And that's all that they could do. And that's Pilate being Pilate. That fits right in with his character. Were those sufficient to get Jesus crucified? Yeah, absolutely. If Jesus killed somebody in the cleansing of the temple, which is highly likely, because he went at people with, a whip and started turning over the tables and beating people. And you have to ask yourself, the temple guard didn't do anything to stop that. Why didn't they?
Oh, that's we can start with that, because there wasn't any tipping of the tables. The money changers, this was the national
5
treasury.
minutes remaining.
There weren't any tables to be tipped. This was something, and each place that the money was exchanged at, they had an armed guard at each one. And if he would have caused any trouble with the money changers, they would have strung him up almost instantly. He caused some kind of trouble. We don't know what that trouble is. But if you look at it, what could he have done? What did he do that he's been remembered for why did the crowd remember him? Why did different people describe him differently? All these people, they martyred him for some reason. Jesus was unknown before he went to the temple. He wasn't son of the God or son of the Father while he was in the temple. He picked up all that after crucifixion. He wasn't deified until after he died. So with that being said, I just don't see him. There was no table tipping. There probably wasn't a whip, but he had to have done something. And with that being said, I believe, my own personal opinion, can't substantiate a bit of it, but I think that he tried to rally the crowd and use the crowd size against the corrupt Herodian temple cult to overthrow him. And if he would have got the crowds behind him, I think that he rallied some. He didn't rally enough. Not enough people wanted to die. And he was martyred for his perceived selfless sacrifice, because he died trying to help the common man against the corrupt greedy Herodian temple cult.
I agree 100%. He was not just the temple cult, but against the Romans as well, because they supported the temple cult. So you have to look at that as a total fixture of what he was trying to accomplish. So at that point, you have to look at it and go, okay, well, why didn't the temple guards do anything to stop what he was doing? And what's your evidence for no tipping of the tables? I'm curious about that. Is there some?
This was the national treasury. This was big money. This was a huge business. They didn't have tables sitting out the crowd to overcome and do this. These were almost like bank tellers. This wasn't something that you messed around or did. No one wanted to get crucified screwing with the money system. But the reason if he did tip, let's say he did tip a table over, the reason they didn't arrest him right then is because the one temple guard might not be able to do anything. But usually when trouble started, they brought in the Roman military. When the Roman military came in, 10,000, 20,000 people died. That disrupts the business when that happens, which Josephus describes the trampling Passover, which when the old man was crushed, when 10,000 people went in reverse and tried to, when the guard urinated towards the crowd and caused a riot. That's why they went out at night and arrested him at night.
Yeah, but again, you're not answering the bigger question, and that is, why didn't the guards do anything?
Because they were afraid of it starting a riot.
They already had that was starting a riot. They had Jesus starting a riot. They didn't. That's what they're there for, is to prevent that kind of behavior. And they did nothing.
Which we don't know that he started a riot. That's just it. That's why I'm asking, what did he do? Did he start a riot? That's what I was trying to get you to say before. If you think that he did start a riot,
absolutely.
Okay, then I think he got the crowd behind him. But again, any disturbance whatsoever. So this was with the hundreds of thousands of people there, and this being a business where Pilate and Caiaphas's lives were on the line for that money to get back to Rome. That money Pilate had to bring back that money with his garrison, and it had to be put on a ship in Caesarea and head back to Rome. And if it didn't, they would get killed. Both Caiaphas and Pilate would have been replaced if that money didn't go back. So
I agree.
You don't want to riot. And so they let Jesus do what he did. I think he started a ruckus. I think that there was a small local riot in one area. He failed to get the crowd behind him, and basically they went back to their camp outside the walls at night, and they went out and arrested him at night, as they should have, to keep a riot from happening. And then they beat him and hung him up.
John, I got to be honest, that's a weak argument. They're there. The temple priests or the temple guards are there. What you call a ruckus is the beginning of a riot. And you stop a riot by stopping the ruckus. You stop it in its tracks. They did nothing, which means that whoever was in charge...
He might have escaped into the crowd. That's just it.
Okay, that's 30 minutes.
It's the details of what happened. That's why I was trying to get you to explain. But you think... But no, you answered my earlier question. Finally, you're saying that he started a full-blown riot in the temple.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, that's good enough. I mean, and I can't disagree with it. I think that he started something, and I think they let it blow over. Is my own opinion, and go out at night, because you send in the Roman troops to quiet. It cuts into the overall grand scheme of the business. And when you talk about Pilate and talking about Barabbas, I think that's a fictional event. Pilate and Caiaphas were entertaining royalty from different countries that came to this festival. They didn't have time to deal with a peasant's thing. There was no trial. There would have been standing orders at that temple. If you disrupted the peace, you would get hung up quickly. If you were a Roman citizen, yes, you would get a trial because you're a Roman citizen. But a peasant, you mess around and they'd string you up, and that's exactly what they did with him.
That's your opinion about it, but that's not what's written down historically in the Gospels.
But that's
and
not
the fact that they went out at night to get Jesus and find him indicates that they did nothing. The guards did nothing at the temple, and they let him go. They let him get away, which means there was some kind of conspiracy or collusion with whoever was in charge of the guards, who said to them, this guy's coming in, he's going to do this, leave him alone, don't touch him. It was their job to stop ruckuses and riots before they got too far advanced. And if they didn't do that with Jesus, and you can say he escaped, and you can say this and that and the other thing, but the point is there's no indication whatsoever that the guards did anything. And had there been, I'm sure that would have been part of the story. They would have arrested him right then, and they would have thrown him in jail.
Okay, let's look at it this way then. Let's take Jesus out of the equation. We're not even talking about Jesus. If trouble breaks out in the temple, do you watch it and do you see what transpires, or do you send in the massacre crew that's just going to go in and kill tens of thousands of people? And so I think they watch and they sit there and they figure out what's going to happen. I think it blew over, and basically it was better to let Jesus play his failed escapades out than it was to send in the goon squad. And because you get a large enough riot and you disrupt the money flow, that was the point. This wasn't about Jesus. This was about disrupting the money flow. If the money flow didn't get too disrupted, they would let it play out, go out at night, pick up the drunk troublemaker, crucify him the next day, which is kind of what the Bible says happened.
We're at opposite points on this. I don't think we're going to see any resolution whatsoever.
Fair enough.
What I see in the writings is that the guards, the temple guards, not the Roman soldiers, were there specifically to step on anything that even looked like it was going to be a problem. Not to sit back and watch and see what happened, or not to sit back and watch and see who.
How does the temple guards, in their limited numbers, deal with hundreds of thousands of people? You can't. They don't have the numbers to handle it like that. And when you're talking about that many people, it's literally you're going to do a military action. And the temple guards, I'm sure, were trained militarily.
How do you get into Disneyland, John?
Okay.
How do you get into Disneyland?
Just like the temple, you paid all the taxes.
You go in kind of through turnstiles, kind of one at a time. Right. It's a choke point, which would have been the case at the temple with all these people that are coming in from elsewhere. There would have been a choke point. And the very first thing that they would have to do is have tables to handle all of these people coming in. So at the choke point, the guards, the temple guards, not the Romans, the temple guards would have been in a great position to deal with any disruption. Okay. They're not talking about all the thousands that you're talking about. We're talking about maybe 100 or 200, whatever. This is just supposition, but they're talking about a small number that they could easily control going through, the turnstiles, as it were.
Well, yeah, the turnstiles, they had to go through the mikvah. Before you could join the temple.
With all these people, you're going to have tables. You're going to have tables, and you're going to have individuals exchanging money for more than one person at a time. Otherwise, you never get through it.
Right. And what I'm saying is they wouldn't have tables that could be tipped over. It's not something that would be set up in the national treasury. They would have it in a very a way to deal with the mass influx of people during and these that we know the entry gates, that they had the multiple entry gates entering the temple, which would have been lined with hanging corpses of crucified victims, setting examples of what not to do. With the stylist telling these attendees, this is what's going to happen as you went into these temples. But you had to go through the mikvah. Even the sheep were washed and cleaned before they could enter the mikvah, which was on the far side of the main entrances. But really interesting history if you study it. even why Pilate had to bring in his canal that he raided the treasury for payment for the water supply going into the temple to handle these massive crowds. Oh, I love the history of this thing. It's epic. It's a heck of a business.
We've gone over our time. Sorry.
But it's okay. Let's go look at the super chats and we'll close. Fisher Ty, thank you for your super chat. Are there any non-New Testament sightings of swoon Jesus?
No.
I would say yes. Josephus, Jesus ben Ananias was actually the gospel Jesus. Did Josephus report on the swoon? No, but he reported on Jesus as a living person that obviously survived the crucifixion. A lot of people will argue with that, but quite frankly, if you read the episode in Josephus, it's pretty clear that this is Jesus of the Gospels who he's talking about. This Jesus ben Ananias hides his identity. He starts out in Jerusalem preaching in 62, the year that his brother James has been killed. He keeps his identity secret for 4 years. And in 66, at the end of those 4 years, is when the main revolt begins. And it's no longer necessary to keep his identity hidden. But he kept it hidden until then because he's still wanted. He was still a wanted man who managed to disappear from his crucifixion. So yeah, I think that plays into the fact that Jesus survived the crucifixion, lived to a ripe old age, was still talking smack about, Jerusalem not stepping forward and not taking care of business against the Romans, identical to what Jesus had been saying in the Gospels. So yeah, I think it's the same guy.
Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. Nicodemus did not leave with Ehrman, but was left inside the tomb with Yeshua as a nurse inside the tomb with a resuscitated Yeshua.
Did not leave with.
A lot of scholars don't think that Joseph of Arimathea was that it's a historical event, and there is no consensus or there is no scholarly that he was buried or not. So we don't even know that he was buried. But that was rich. And again, you have to assume that he's rich to think that he was buried. That's my take on it.
Well, the Gospels say he was buried. They say he was buried in a new tomb. Arimathea is a Greek term for arrow. In Greek means to take down, to take away. And Matthew or Mathea means the gift of God. So Joseph of Arimathea is the father or the person who takes Jesus down from the cross. That's okay. It's she's not asking,
did he nurse Jesus back to health is what she's asking.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Again, the physical damage for Jesus was not what you see in Mel Gibson's, The Passion or whatever. It wasn't that severe. Okay. In fact, the people that were around Pilate were surprised that Jesus had passed away so soon because he hadn't been beaten that much. He was not in that bad physical shape. The other thing is that when Jesus, the date of 37 is when I think that the crucifixion took place. And at that time, there were back-to-back Sabbaths. So there would have been a Sabbath for the Passover, and then there would have been the weekly Sabbath starting Friday evening going through to Saturday evening. Okay, they're back-to-back. What happens at that point? Everybody clears the streets. Nobody's around to see Jesus basically walking around or being helped with other, people that take him out of the tomb. So this was planned in advance. They knew that there was, side-by-side Sabbaths coming up and that everybody would be gone off the streets. That just worked into their plans. So yes, was he, treated? Yeah. Yeah, he was treated in the tomb. That's why you have the story about the myrrh and the frankincense. Those are medicinal herbs that help aid in healing and relieve pain. So, yeah, I mean, they had the means there to take care of him. They took care of him. They dressed him up, got him out of the tomb, and took off. And he spent the next couple of days, recovering from his ordeal. But he was capable of walking. He was capable of talking. And he says to Mary, "Don't touch me." So I'm sure he was still pretty sore, but he was capable of getting up and moving around.
So one gospel says that he was beat so hard in the flagellation that he couldn't carry his cross, and he got help. And then the other one says he carried it his whole way. Which one is it?
Well, this gets into a whole different thing about genetics, and that he had a genetic problem called G6PD or Fauvism. He had a genetic disposition to have hemolytic anemia based on certain triggers. And so he would have been very, very tired when he went to trial, when he was expected to carry the cross. Could have been either one. Was he too tired from the G6PD? Could have been easily. Part of the example for that is that he doesn't really answer to Antipas or Pilate or whatever when they're asking him questions. He's having physical problems based on that genetic component. This is also why, and he wasn't stabbed through the chest, he was poked and blood and water came out. Okay, that's a sign of hemolytic anemia. The consensus that the pericardium was stabbed is ridiculous. I can tell you, I've had pericardial effusion. I've had open heart surgery. And one of the results of that was pericardial effusion. Now, normally in a normal heart, the pericardium has 1 to 3 tablespoons of fluid surrounding it. It's basically a lubricant so that when the heart beats, it doesn't rub up against the pericardial sac. For me, when they cut open my heart and I had pericardial effusion, it took a few days, but they took off almost 800 cc's of fluid from the pericardial sac. It's not something that would have happened if he had been stabbed through the heart. What came out was blood and fluid, which is hemolytic anemia. And you can say what you want, but to me, anybody creating a story like that, and it's a very rare condition, good luck that somebody in the first century would have known that. What they're doing is reporting an actual historical event. Okay.
We got a couple of more super chats. Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. According to the Christian religion, the eternal spirit cannot die, so every human being resurrects.
Every human, according to the Bible, has the possibility with the rapture, and resurrection was quite common in the first century, first and early second century. I mean, Jesus brought back the different people. So according to the Christian religion, the eternal spirit cannot die. That's correct. And so every human being does have the possibility to resurrect. Every human being does not. They have the possibility. It doesn't mean that they will.
That's more of a theological question, and I'm more interested in the history of the Gospels and the historical Jesus than that question. But John seemed to answer that pretty well.
Efficient High, thank you for your super chat. David, please expand on Jesus' father being a priest.
It's interesting that in the stories that we read in the Gospels, that the 3 men that were most prevalent in Jesus's life are all named Joseph. I believe that Jesus's father was Joseph Caiaphas. He was the high priest at the time. He would have had control of the temple guards. He was the son-in-law of Annas or Ananias. So when Josephus talks about Jesus ben Ananias, he's directing you to understand who this Jesus was related to. Ananias would have been Jesus's maternal grandfather. When Jesus is left behind and his when he's about 12 and his family comes back to find him in Jerusalem, basically he tells them, where else would I be but at my father's house? He's not talking about God. He's talking about Caiaphas. He's talking about his father, the high priest, probably just a priest at that point, maybe not the high priest, but priest at that point. Is there any connection historically to this? Well, surprisingly, yeah, there's an archaeological find called Miriam's ossuary, and on it is inscribed, Miriam, daughter of Jesus, son of Caiaphas. So Caiaphas actually had a son named Jesus. Now, plenty of people are going to throw up the hand, oh, Jesus was a common name. Great, that's an observation. Yeah, you got to take it into account. Doesn't refute what I'm saying. Could Caiaphas have had a son named Jesus? Yeah. Could that Jesus have been the gospel Jesus? Yeah. Again, with the birth of Jesus and the wealth involved and the people, the shepherds being there, the civic leaders being there, that indicates that his father and mother were prominent citizens that came out to witness the birth. That is why supposedly, people came from all around to witness this, because they knew that his mother was pregnant and due to deliver a child. Poor family would not have had that reaction, ever. There wouldn't have been people gathered around. There wouldn't have been shepherds. There wouldn't have been flocks, of people. Wouldn't have happened. It only happened because they were a prominent family. So you have evidence that Caiaphas had a son named Jesus. You have evidence that Jesus was a descendant of Ananias. You have evidence that Ananias was the father-in-law to Caiaphas. I think there's pretty strong indication that, and Joseph of Arimathea, Joseph, Jesus' father, is the one that arrow took him down from the cross. He took the gift of God down from the cross. Was, Joseph Caiaphas a believer in Jesus's ministry and mission? Well, he was one of the longest serving high priests or priests in the first century. So he was popular both with the Romans and with the general population. Otherwise, he would have been taken out very shortly after coming on board if he was not popular. So, yeah, I think Joseph Caiaphas is the father of Jesus. They were both priests. I don't think Josephus indicated tekton was a derogatory term, and that the reason it was used in conjunction with Jesus and his father was because they were both priests and they both worked on the temple as tektons.
So, John, do you have any more to say?
So Caiaphas was a tekton?
Huh?
Caiaphas,
I'm sorry?
you think Caiaphas was a tekton?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. He could have been, he would have been a priest very early in his life. It was handed down, through families. Was he a high priest at that point? No. Could he have been working as just a priest at that point to work on the temple? Yes. There were Josephus indicates there were like 3,000 priests that were trained in building skills to build the temple. That's a lot of priests.
So Caiaphas was a Hellenist. So are you claiming that Jesus also was a Hellenist according to your view?
No, I'm not claiming that. I'm not even sure that Caiaphas was. I mean, you say that like there's some, documentation somewhere that says, oh, Caiaphas was a Hellenist. No, you're lumping them in. And there are always exceptions to the rules that you're using. You're saying that, the priests were Hellenists. Well, yeah, but
We know
there's
quite a bit about Caiaphas and where he came from, where he was raised, and I believe that there's enough history on Caiaphas to know that he's a Hellenist. I don't think it's in dispute in any way. But if you say it is, I'll look that evidence up.
Where are you getting your information of where he was born? I'm really interested in that.
Where he was
from? Where was he from?
That's what I'm saying. I have to do the homework on Caiaphas. I didn't know Caiaphas's heritage was going to come up, but I've studied it in the past, and I know that it's guaranteed that he was a Hellenist. And
I can tell you where his priestly responsibilities were because it was on the Miriam ossuary, and it indicates that Miriam, daughter of Jesus, son of Caiaphas, priest of, and I can't remember the name, but it indicates that it was near Tiberias, that it was near a hot spring near Tiberias. So when Jesus talks about walking to Emau, that's the Greek word for hot springs. So where his father had basically his flock, in a sense, where his responsibilities were, was near to Tiberias. And there was a hot springs there. So that's kind of, even though Jesus was born in Jerusalem and raised early on in Jerusalem and Judea, his father was taking care of business over in Galilee near Tiberias. And you can look up that Miriam, inscription, and you'll see it all laid out. It'll tell you where he's from, where, priests had to kind of congregate and live together, and where his flock was gathered near Tiberias. It's all in the inscription.
Well, in fact, our next super chat question is about that ossuary, Caiaphas ossuary. I thank you for your super chat. For your insight, Caiaphas ossuary was found at Arimathea Talpiot.
Okay, but we're talking about Miriam, his granddaughter, right now, and where her ossuary was found was near the valley of Elah, which was where David killed Goliath with a stone. And I suspect that the nickname Caiaphas is based on that, because Kaifa or Kepha is the Aramaic word for stone. And Josephus makes it pretty clear that Joseph Caiaphas was not Joseph ben Caiaphas. He was Joseph called Caiaphas, which would have been a nickname. So Miriam and her ossuary being found in that area would indicate that there was some kind of familial connection to that area. Either that or she just moved out and moved on her own. But my guess would be that there was some kind of familial connection to that area.
Slower Knight, thank you for your super chat. Hebrews 9:27, once to die, then the judgment. So every human being is resurrected for judgment, save as Jesus.
John?
I think he's reading it out of context, but no, every human being isn't resurrected as Jesus, save as Jesus. I'm not sure what he's getting at. Maybe he could send in the question a little differently so we can understand what he's getting at. Maybe he's talking about the spirit going to heaven if you qualify. Tough one. I didn't understand the context quite well. I apologize.
I expanded on the ossuary. Miriam, daughter of Jesus, son of Caiaphas, Maziah from Beth Imre.
Right.
That is the full inscription, he says.
Right. There you go.
All right, Slower Knight. said, "For
And
they
Isaiah is the location near Tiberias.
as us gods, knowing good and evil," is a direct quote from Genesis 3:22. Okay, I don't know if that's
Did they
that's not an
plagiarize?
explanation.
Did the New
We'll check it
Testament
out.
scribes plagiarize Genesis? It's possible they plagiarized a lot of the Torah and used it and alluded to it in the text. Is there an actual tie? I would go to Bible Hub and I would look for that cross reference.
The Cross Bible is also a good website for that kind of research too. Okay. Well, I think we can go ahead and close. Dave and John, do either of you have any final statements? Or
Well, thank you, David. If I came across rough or cross, I'm just trying to bring out the best in you, and I'd like you to see you polish up your research better than you already did. And my goal was just to try to bring the best out in you. So if I seemed a little too rough, I do apologize.
Well, yeah, the tinfoil hat thing was a bit much, but
sorry.
I'm a big boy.
Fair
John,
enough. Enjoy our conversations.
It was nice meeting you. Yeah,
Thank you,
we
sir.
are at cross purposes as to how we see, the available evidence one way or another. And that's okay. That's okay. The only thing I do is I take exception very clearly with scholarly consensus as an argument without
I have my own opinion. It just happens to align with
that's what I'm saying.
With a lot of the center right down the middle. So it's just what they trained me to evaluate. I was trained to evaluate the evidence, and so that's if you want to blame the training, but I've enjoyed it, and I find this an epic hobby that you can never learn too much of. When you study the Bible, you're not studying God, you're studying people. And the study of people is fascinating to me, and I absolutely cherish this hobby.
And the link to purchase The Open Tomb, David Mirsch's book, is in the description below, and it will be in the pinned comment. Also, the link to David and John's respective YouTube channels are tagged in the description below, will also be provided in the pinned comment. So, Dave and John, thank you for joining me today and for the debate.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, John. It was interesting. It was fun. Take care.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.